Hello again, students. We're going to wrap up our examination of the problems and challenges of the late 19th century by examining the Gilded Age. Now, an object that has been gilded is usually one of cheap quality that has a thin layer of gold put over top of it to give it the appearance of being rich or expensive. And the term Gilded Age was applied to late 19th century politics by Mark Twain in a book he co-authored by the same title, because he saw this as an era with a thin veneer of prosperity and progress under which was rampant corruption and graft. And this corruption and graft we've already gotten a little bit of a hint of as it has permeated much of American society in the late 19th century. We saw it in the South where accusations of corruption were used to undermine Republican governments and African American politicians to bring an end to Reconstruction. And we saw it in the West with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, whose corrupt agents often skimmed on supplies for the American Indians who were kept on the reservations, much to their detriment. This corruption permeated all levels of government as well as all areas. In the federal level of government, President Grant's administration is seen as particularly corrupt, particularly the second term. Grant himself does not seem to have been corrupt. More what he seems to be, and other presidents, like Hayes, who will follow him, seem to have the same problem of picking the wrong people to be in positions of power. Grant's vice president was indicted for trying to steal profits from the Union Pacific Railroad, but his private secretary, Secretary of War, and even his brother-in-law were all implicated in some sort of scam or scandal of another sort. The political cartoon here kind of shows Grant attempting to hold up his administration and all of the corrupt politicians and office seekers who are a part of it. On the local level, city officials sold public construction contracts to friends or skimmed money from the Treasury. The Tweed Ring in New York City is notorious for having plundered money from New York's Treasury. But this was the idea of graft that, when we examine part of the problem with the corruption is that it is tied in with industrialization. Like so many of these other changes and challenges that we're seeing, they take their roots in the Industrial Revolution. The growth of cities offered tremendous opportunities for graft and to skim money, as cities were spending large amounts of money on building projects, to put in new roads and sewers, to knock down the tenement buildings and replace them. And this provided a great opportunity for politicians to award contracts to their friends for really high amounts, much larger than is necessary for them to complete the project. And then the construction company and the politician split the profits. Interestingly enough, all of this corruption actually increased voter participation, and the Gilded Age has some of the highest rates of voter participation of any era in American history. Now, there's a really good graph of this in the wall at the Hayes Presidential Library, and a lot of good information about the Gilded Age in general there, because Hayes was president during this time period. Party loyalty and this sort of fierce devotion to the party, almost regardless of political stances, as the parties in this time period were fairly close together on big issues, both pro-business, both pro-expansion and such, is kind of a hallmark of this era that reminds me a lot of the current political age, where party loyalty is very, very strong, regardless of candidate. A couple of things helped secure this party loyalty and party strength during the Gilded Age. One was the use of the spoils system. And this comes from the expression, to the victor goes the spoils, meaning whoever wins public office gets to appoint a bunch of people to positions within the government. Postmaster General is oftentimes one of the big ones, or a postmaster of an area. is usually seen as a particularly lucrative job. And what that meant was these political parties, when they would, a new politician would get elected, he would appoint a whole bunch of people who had helped get him elected. And this helped to secure loyalty and ensure support from big donors, but it also meant that we ended up with a lot of people who weren't really qualified for their jobs in these governmental positions because they had been big donors or supporters of the guy who got elected. It also means there's a tremendous amount of turnover from one person to the next. If you lose the next election, all the people you appointed are going to get fired, and the guy who won is going to replace them with his people. And this means there's no sort of continuation, and many people don't have a lot of time to learn how to do their job well. And so there's always sort of like a new guy, as there's this constant turnover in these positions. One of the other things that parties used were the political machines. This is a Thomas Nast cartoon depicting Tammany Hall, which was the Democratic political machine in New York City. The Republicans had their own in their cities. One of the more famous ones was the Pendergast machine in Kansas City. Boss Tweed is the large man on the left that I had mentioned before, and he was the head of this ring. And a lot of times the people who were heads of these weren't elected officials themselves. These bosses were just the heads of the party, and they kind of played kingmaker. They picked who was going to run for their party, and essentially they were anointed because these machines worked to organize blocks of voters in the cities, which means particularly immigrants, to support their party and help to get their guy elected. And so it almost virtually assured that, at least like in New York, a Democratic politician would win. In Kansas City, a Republican was always going to win. So when Tweed picked a guy to run as the Democratic candidate, he was basically picking the guy who was going to win the office. Now, this assuredness tended to breed corruption because you were very unlikely to lose elections. On the other hand, it increased voter participation because they coordinated these blocks of voters, usually by neighborhood, by promising to deal with, and oftentimes they actually would fix, neighborhood problems, paving the street, running a new sewer line, knocking down old tenements, etc. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of these problems had their roots in the Industrial Revolution, and the prosperity that this created, at least for the wealthy business owners, created a lot of money. There was a lot of money that was out there, and these business owners could use that money to bribe political officials, such to the point that we get this political cartoon by one of my favorite political cartoonists, Joseph Kepler, depicting the Senate as the pawns of the rich monopolies and trusts. Here we see the Senate chamber. The door in the back is locked. It says closed in the people's interests. And it says this Senate is of the monopolists, by the monopolists, and for the monopolists, depicting the over exaggerated influence that money and the rich businesses had on our government. And as I said before, government tended to be very pro-business because the big businesses were what was driving the economy, but it is also in no small amount due to the fact that these businesses often had politicians in their pockets. They had copious amounts of money to spend on bribing them and helping them to get elected. Now, political cartoonists like Kepler and Thomas Nast tried to draw attention to this corruption, and they reached a much wider audience than many articles would because a lot of Americans were still illiterate, but they could understand these. In fact, Thomas Nast's cartoons irked Boss Tweed so much, he said, my constituents can't read, but they understand those damned cartoons. And in fact, when Tweed tried to escape charges of corruption by fleeing to Spain, he was caught because Spanish authorities recognized him based on Thomas Nast's cartoons. The government will make a sort of anemic attempt at battling this corruption with the Pendleton Civil Service Act. And what it did is it required that people wanting a government job, or at least specific government jobs at that time, to pass a civil service exam. Now, this is pretty much standard for all government employees today, but at the time it only applied to a few key positions, but it was a step in the right direction. And this was to help ensure that the people who were doing the jobs were actually qualified for them. Passing this act may have been given something of a boost by the assassination of President Garfield. Garfield was shot in the back at a train station by a man named Charles Guiteau, who believed that his assistance in helping Garfield get elected entitled him to the ambassadorship to France. He really didn't do a whole lot. Garfield had no idea who he was, but Guiteau was probably more than a little bit mentally ill. But the assassination of the president, based on this sort of spoil system, really kind of brought the nation's attention to the problem, and there was some efforts made to address it. Lastly, I'm going to try to just sort of give you the basics of the arguments over economic policy in the Gilded Age. You don't need to know all the deep details on it, just the sort of basics. And to be quite honest, economic policy is something that still confuses me today. But one of the things you need to understand is there wasn't a lot of incentive for the parties to work together. We oftentimes had split governments and very close elections, which a split government would be when the president is from one party and one or both houses of Congress is controlled by the other political party. Now, this would seem to be a good thing because it would force the two sides to cooperate. But because the elections were always close, there was a really good chance that you were going to flip that House of Congress, or the White House would come back into your control in the next election. So there was very little incentive for the parties to actually work together. So instead, they would oftentimes just block the other guy's attempts to make anything get done for the next couple years until the next election, and then be able to point to that party and say, oh, see, they didn't get anything accomplished, and help their side get elected. And then the process would start all over again. If that sounds familiar to you, you must pay attention to American government today. The Panic of 1873 did kind of light a little bit of a fire under the backsides of these politicians, as they were very concerned about the U.S. economy collapsing. We were becoming much, much more dependent on the success of businesses and banks in America. And in 1873, banks had overlended to the railroads and were in danger of collapsing when those loans couldn't come due. Again, that may sound familiar. But little was really accomplished in this. They were very split on how they wanted to handle economics. The Republicans, who drew a lot of their base from the Northern industrialists, wanted to keep tariffs high, for example, because it protected those businesses. The Democrats, who drew a lot of support from the rural areas in the South and the West, wanted to keep tariffs low because the farmers tended to buy those manufactured products and it would help keep the prices down. The other thing is this idea of how we back our money. Do we just back it based on the amount of gold that the government has, how much gold is in America, and the value of the dollar is based on a fraction of that amount? Or do we count how much gold and silver we have as part of the value of the dollar? Now, backing it with gold was favored by the bankers because it would keep the value of the individual dollar high, and especially those who held that money. If it was backed with just gold, it would keep the value of your dollars worth much higher. If you backed it with both gold and silver, which was oftentimes favored by the farmers, it would allow them to print up more money, which would devalue the individual dollars, but it would put more of it out there to be loaned out, and they hoped would help to raise crop prices. We'll get back into this a little bit more in topic 3 when we talk about a political group called the Populists, who favored this bimetallism and were sort of an example of cooperation among farmers for political gain. The graphic organizer for this lesson is set up like an outline of an essay with the thesis, Corruption and Partisanship Paralyzed the Government During the Gilded Age. So the first body paragraph about corruption and scandal, give me 3 examples of that. The second one, the spoils system and political machines, explain how each one helped parties as well as led to corruption. The third one, political cartoonists and civil service reform, explain how each one attempted to battle corruption. And the last one, give me 2 examples of the fight over economic policy. I have filled in the political machines one for you, and you can see that there. I'll see you next time. Te amo. Adios.